The first time Ethan Barnes heard her voice, he thought an angel had descended into the dust and sagebrush of southeastern Colorado. It was late August of 1876, and the sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Lyon, a small town that had grown up around the old military post along the Arkansas River. Ethan had been riding for 3 days straight, following a small herd of cattle he had been hired to deliver to a rancher just outside of town. The dust had settled into every crease of his clothing, every line of his weathered face, and he wanted nothing more than a hot meal and a bed that did not sway beneath him like his horse's gait. But then he heard it, a voice so pure and clear it stopped him mid-step on the dusty Main Street. The song drifted through the hot afternoon air, carried on a breeze that smelled of cotton and lye soap. He followed the sound without thinking, his tired feet carrying him down a side street lined with modest wooden houses. There she was, standing in a yard behind a white picket fence that had seen better days. Her dark auburn hair was pinned up in a simple bun, wisps escaping to frame her face as she reached up to hang a white sheet on the clothesline. She sang as she worked, her voice lifting the words of a hymn he did not recognize into the cloudless sky. Ethan stood there, his hat in his hands though he could not remember removing it, watching her move from the basket to the line and back again. Her dress was simple calico, faded from many washings, but she moved with such grace that she might have been wearing silk. When she reached for another sheet, her voice rose higher, and he felt something in his chest tighten. He did not realize he had been standing there long enough to appear strange until she turned and saw him. Her singing stopped abruptly, and color flooded her cheeks. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice still musical even in speech. Her eyes were green, he noticed, the color of new grass after spring rain. Ethan felt heat creep up his own neck. "I apologize, miss. I did not mean to stare. Your singing, it is beautiful." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those remarkable eyes. "Thank you. Most folks around here are used to it by now. You must be new in town." "Just passing through," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wondered if that was still true. "Name is Ethan Barnes. Grace Zimmerman," she replied, wiping her damp hands on her apron. "Welcome to Fort Lyon, Mr. Barnes. If you are looking for work, you might try the Hendricks Ranch about 5 miles west. They are always needing good cowboys." "I appreciate the information." He stood there another moment, searching for something else to say, any excuse to keep her talking. "That song you were singing, I have never heard it before." Grace smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "It is an old German hymn my grandmother taught me. She came over from Bavaria when she was just a girl. Most of the songs I know are from her. You know many of them?" "Dozens," she said, then laughed softly. "Probably too many. My father used to say I would wear out the angels themselves with all my singing." The way she said "used to" told Ethan that her father was no longer around to say such things. He wanted to ask, but it seemed too forward for a first meeting. "I should let you get back to your work," he said reluctantly. "Thank you for the kindness, Miss Zimmerman. Grace, please, and you are welcome, Mr. Barnes." "Ethan," he said. She nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, and turned back to her laundry basket. As he walked away, she began singing again, a different song this time, but just as beautiful. Ethan found himself walking slower than necessary, wanting to hold onto the sound for as long as possible. That night, lying in a rented bed at the boarding house on Main Street, Ethan could not stop thinking about Grace Zimmerman. It had been a long time since a woman had affected him this way. Years of drifting from job to job, town to town, had left him cynical about such things. Love was for men with stable lives and money in their pockets, not for cowboys who lived out of saddlebags. But there had been something about her, something beyond just her beauty or her voice. A quality he could not quite name but felt deep in his bones. The next morning, he went to the Hendricks ranch as she had suggested. The owner, a grizzled man named Samuel Hendricks, looked him over with a critical eye before finally nodding. "You look like you can handle yourself on a horse." "Can you mend fence?" "Yes, sir. Rope a steer. Been doing it since I was 12. "Break a green horse without breaking your neck." Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "Most of the time." Hendricks grunted, which Ethan took as approval. "Pay is $30 a month plus meals. Bunkhouse is behind the main barn. You start tomorrow at dawn." "Thank you, sir. I will be here." As Ethan rode back toward town, he told himself it was because the job was good and the pay was fair. It had nothing to do with a certain woman with green eyes and a voice like heaven. He almost believed it. The following weeks fell into a rhythm. Ethan worked hard on the Hendricks ranch, mending miles of fence, herding cattle, and doing the 100 other tasks that needed doing on a working ranch. The work was familiar and satisfying, and his body remembered the movements even when his mind wandered. And his mind wandered often, usually in the direction of Grace Zimmerman's yard. He found excuses to ride past her house whenever he went into town. At first he told himself he was just taking a different route, exploring the area. But he knew the truth. He was hoping to hear her sing again. It became a pattern. Every few days, he would hear that clear voice rising above the mundane sounds of the town. Sometimes it was in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon. She sang while hanging laundry, while sweeping her small porch, while tending the vegetable garden that grew along the side of her house. The songs were always different, always beautiful, and always in words he did not understand. One Saturday afternoon in early September, Ethan finally worked up the courage to stop his horse at her fence again. Grace was pinning up what looked like dish towels, her voice lifting in a song that sounded particularly joyful. "Good afternoon, Grace," he called when she paused to retrieve more towels from her basket. She turned, surprise crossing her face before it settled into a warm smile. "Ethan, I wondered if I would see you again. Did you find work at the Hendricks place?" "I did, thanks to your suggestion." He dismounted, walking closer to the fence. "I have been meaning to thank you properly." "No need for thanks. I am just glad it worked out." She tilted her head, studying him. "You look well. The work must agree with you." "It does." He hesitated, then asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Grace, those songs you sing, could you teach them to me?" Her eyes widened. "Teach you? Why would you want to learn them?" Ethan felt his face heat but pressed on. "They are beautiful. And I thought maybe if I knew the words I could join in sometimes. If you would not mind, that is." Something soft and wondering crossed her face. "You want to sing hymns with me while I hang laundry, if you would let me, yes." Grace was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she smiled. "All right, Ethan Barnes, come back tomorrow after church, and I will teach you your first hymn." That night, Ethan lay awake in the bunkhouse, listening to the snores of the other ranch hands and wondering what he had gotten himself into. He had never been much of a singer. His voice was decent enough around a campfire, but nothing special. Yet the thought of standing next to Grace, learning her grandmother's songs, made something warm unfurl in his chest. Sunday afternoon found him freshly washed and wearing his best shirt, which admittedly was not saying much. He knocked on Grace's front door, hat in hand, feeling more nervous than he had been in years. Grace answered wearing a simple green dress that matched her eyes. Her hair was down, falling in waves past her shoulders, and Ethan had to remind himself to breathe. "Come in," she said, stepping back to let him enter. "I have tea brewing." Her house was small but immaculately kept. A worn sofa sat against one wall, a small table and 2 chairs against another. Lace curtains hung at the windows, and a vase of wildflowers brightened the mantel above the fireplace. Everything spoke of modest means but careful attention. "Your home is lovely," Ethan said. "Thank you. It was my parents' house. They left it to me when they passed." She moved into the small kitchen area and poured tea from a china pot into 2 mismatched cups. "My mother died when I was 16. My father followed 2 years later. That was 3 years ago now. I am sorry for your loss." Ethan accepted the tea, noting how her hands trembled slightly as she passed him the cup. "It is the way of things," she said softly, "but I still miss them every day, especially when I sing. My grandmother taught me the songs, but it was my mother who encouraged me to sing them always, no matter what I was doing. She said it kept the spirit light and the heart hopeful." She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Grace sat down at the table, gesturing for Ethan to join her. "But you did not come here to listen to me talk about sad things. You came to learn hymns." For the next 2 hours, Grace taught him the words to a song called Befeal Du Dane Weege, which she said meant "Commit thou all thy ways." She sang each line slowly, having him repeat it back until he could match her pronunciation. Her patience seemed endless, even when he stumbled over the unfamiliar German words. "Your accent is actually quite good," she said, after he had managed to get through the first verse without stopping. "Have you studied languages before?" "Some Spanish from working on ranches down in Texas, but this is different, harder. German can be challenging, but you are doing well." She smiled at him, and Ethan felt that warmth in his chest again. "Would you like to try singing it all the way through with me?" They stood in her small parlor, and Grace counted them in. Her voice rose clear and strong, and Ethan did his best to follow along. His voice was rougher than hers, weathered by years of trail dust and cigarette smoke, but it blended with hers in a way that felt right. When they finished, Grace was beaming. "That was wonderful, Ethan. Really wonderful. Only because of you," he said. "Your voice carries mine." "No," she said firmly. "You have a good voice, strong and true. You just need practice." Over the following weeks, Ethan came back every Sunday after church. They would sit in her parlor, or if the weather was nice, on her small back porch, and she would teach him hymns. He learned Ein fest Borg ist unser Gott, and Why schön leuchtet der Morgenstern, and Nun danket alle Gott. The words were still foreign to him, but slowly they began to make sense, especially when Grace translated them. "This one is about trusting in God's provision," she would say, or "This one speaks of God's enduring faithfulness." Each song carried meaning, weight, history. Grace told him about her grandmother, who had fled religious persecution in Bavaria, and brought these songs across the ocean as her most precious possession. She used to say that as long as we sang, we could never truly be lost. Grace said one afternoon as they sat on her porch, watching the sun sink toward the western mountains. "The songs connect us to who we are, where we came from. They remind us that we are part of something larger than ourselves." Ethan thought about his own family, scattered and mostly forgotten. His parents had died when he was young, and he had been raised by an uncle who saw him more as free labor than kin. At 16, he had struck out on his own and never looked back. For years, he had thought of himself as a man without roots, without history. But listening to Grace talk about her grandmother's songs, he felt a longing for something he had never known he was missing. "You ever wish you could go back?" he asked. "See the places your grandmother came from?" Grace was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. "Sometimes, but this is my home now. America, Colorado, this little house in Fort Lyon, this is where I belong." She turned to look at him. "What about you? Where do you belong, Ethan Barnes? It was a question he had never been able to answer before. But sitting there on her porch, the evening air cooling around them, he found himself saying, I think maybe I am starting to figure that out. Something shifted in her expression, a softness that made his heart beat faster. But before either of them could say anything more, her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, called out a greeting as she walked past, and the moment dissolved. October brought cooler weather and the first hints of the winter to come. The work at the ranch intensified as they prepared for the changing season, and Ethan found himself working longer hours. But he never missed a Sunday with Grace. One particular Sunday, he arrived to find her in the backyard, hanging laundry as usual. She was singing Befeel Du Dane Weege, the first song she had taught him, and without thinking, Ethan joined in. Grace turned, surprise and delight mingling on her face as his voice rose to meet hers. They sang the entire hymn together, their voices twining in the crisp autumn air. When the last note faded, Grace was staring at him with shining eyes. You have been practicing, she said. Every day while riding fence. The cows don't seem to mind, he smiled. Though I think they prefer your voice to mine, Grace laughed, a sound as bright as her singing. I doubt that very much. Ethan, you have learned so quickly, I am impressed. I had a good teacher. He stepped closer to the fence. And good motivation. What motivation is that? He looked at her directly, letting her see the truth in his eyes. I wanted to be part of your world, even if just for the length of a song. Grace's breath caught and color flooded her cheeks. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she set down her laundry basket and walked to the fence, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. Ethan, she said softly, you have been part of my world for quite some time now. Surely you must know that. His heart hammered in his chest. Grace, I am just a cowboy. I have $30 to my name and a horse that has seen better days, but if you would consider it, I would like to court you properly. Her smile started slow, then spread until it lit up her entire face. I would like that very much. You would, Ethan Barnes. You rode past my house nearly every day for weeks before you ever spoke to me. Did you think I did not notice? Did you think I sang so often by accident? She reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the fence post. I have been hoping you would ask for quite some time now. The touch of her hand sent warmth flooding through him. Then I have been a fool for waiting so long. A gentleman, she corrected. There is a difference. From that day forward, things changed between them. Ethan still came every Sunday for singing lessons, but now he also came on Wednesday evenings for supper. Grace proved to be an excellent cook, making the most of simple ingredients. They would eat together at her small table, talking about their days, their pasts, their hopes for the future. Ethan learned that Grace took in sewing to supplement the small inheritance her parents had left her. She was skilled with a needle, and several of the town's wealthier women employed her to make their dresses and mend their fine linens. It was modest work, but combined with her careful management of the household, it allowed her to maintain her independence. I know most women my age are already married with children, she said one evening as she mended one of his shirts. But after my father died, I needed to prove to myself that I could manage alone. I needed to know I was capable. You are more than capable, Ethan said. You are remarkable. She looked up from her sewing, her eyes soft. You are good for my pride, Ethan Barnes. I only speak the truth. As October turned to November, the whole town seemed to notice their courtship. Mrs. Patterson made a point of telling Grace how fortunate she was to have found such a respectable young man. The owner of the general store winked at Ethan when he came in to buy a new shirt for his Wednesday suppers. Even Samuel Hendricks commented on how much lighter Ethan seemed lately. A good woman will do that to a man, the ranch owner said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "Treat her right, and you will never regret it." Ethan had no intention of doing anything else. One Wednesday evening in late November, Grace answered the door wearing a troubled expression. Ethan immediately sensed something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked as soon as he stepped inside. "What has happened?" Grace twisted her hands together. A gesture he had learned meant she was anxious. "I received a letter today from my grandmother's sister. My great-aunt Greta in Pennsylvania. She is quite elderly now and has asked if I would consider coming to live with her. She has no other family and needs someone to help care for her." Ethan felt his stomach drop. Pennsylvania. "That is very far away, I know." Grace looked miserable. "I do not want to go, Ethan. I love my home here. I love Fort Lyon. I love my life. But she is family and she is old and alone. How can I refuse her?" He crossed the room and took her hands in his. "Grace, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, and he saw tears shimmering there. "You are one of the kindest people I have ever known," he said. "It speaks to your character that you would even consider this. But Grace, you have to live your own life. You cannot sacrifice your happiness out of obligation." "But what if I am being selfish? What if she truly needs me? Does she have no one else? No other family at all?" Grace shook her head. "Not according to her letter. My grandmother was her only sister and she never married." Ethan was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "Write to her. Ask her about her situation, what kind of help she needs. Maybe there is another solution. Maybe we could help her find a companion there in Pennsylvania, someone local who could assist her." "That is a possibility," Grace said slowly. "I had not thought of that. And Grace, if it turns out she truly has no other option, if she genuinely cannot manage without family, well." He paused, gathering his courage. "Pennsylvania is not the end of the world. If you had to go, you would not have to go alone." Her eyes widened. "Ethan, what are you saying?" "I am saying that wherever you are is where I want to be. If that is Pennsylvania or Colorado or anywhere else on this earth, it makes no difference to me. I love you, Grace Zimmerman. I have loved you since the first moment I heard you sing." A tear spilled down her cheek, but she was smiling. "I love you too. I think I have since you first stood at my fence looking so earnest and asked to learn my grandmother's hymns." He pulled her close, holding her against his chest, feeling her heart beat against his. "Then we will figure this out together. Whatever comes, we will face it together." Grace wrote to her great-aunt that very evening, explaining her situation and offering to help find a local woman who could serve as a companion. She also, after much deliberation and encouragement from Ethan, gently explained that she was being courted and hoped to marry soon. The weeks of waiting for a reply were difficult. Grace threw herself into her work, taking on extra sewing projects to keep her hands and mind busy. Ethan spent his free time helping her around the house, fixing a loose board on her porch, cleaning out her gutters, chopping firewood for the winter. They sang together often now, not just during his Sunday visits but whenever they were together. He had learned enough hymns that they could stand side by side at her clothesline and sing in harmony while she hung sheets and towels. The neighbors grew accustomed to the sound of two voices rising in German hymns, and more than once, someone would stop on the street to listen. "You two should sing in church," Mrs. Patterson suggested one afternoon. "Everyone would love it." Grace and Ethan exchanged glances, and something passed between them. The next Sunday, they approached the minister after the service and offered to sing a hymn the following week. The minister, delighted, readily agreed. That Sunday, they stood at the front of the small church and sang "Nun danket alle Gott," which Grace had explained meant, "Now thank we all our God." Their voices filled the simple sanctuary, blending together in a way that moved several members of the congregation to tears. Afterward, people crowded around them, offering congratulations and asking to hear more. It was the first time Ethan had ever felt truly part of a community, truly connected to the people around him. He looked at Grace and saw the same wonder reflected in her eyes. The letter from Pennsylvania arrived in early December, just as the first real snow began to fall. Grace opened it with trembling hands while Ethan sat beside her at the kitchen table. "Dear Grace," she read aloud, "thank you for your thoughtful letter. I must confess, when I wrote to you, I was having a particularly difficult day and felt very alone. But in the weeks since, my neighbor's daughter has been coming by daily to help me, and I find I am managing better than I thought. Your suggestion about finding a local companion is a wise one, and I will look into it seriously. Please do not feel obligated to uproot your life for an old woman's moment of loneliness. Stay in Colorado. Marry your cowboy. I only wish I could be there to attend the wedding. With love, Aunt Greta." Grace lowered the letter, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "She said to marry my cowboy." Ethan grinned. "She is a wise woman." Ethan Barnes, was that a proposal? He stood up, then did something he had been planning for weeks. He lowered himself to one knee beside her chair and took her hand. "Grace Zimmerman, I know we have not been courting long by conventional standards, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You are the best person I have ever known. Your voice, your kindness, your strength, everything about you makes me want to be a better man. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Grace did not hesitate. "Yes. Oh, yes, Ethan. Of course I will marry you." He stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her for the first time. It was sweet and tender and perfect, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were laughing. "I do not have a ring yet," Ethan said, "but I have been saving my wages. I will get you one as soon as I can." "I do not need a fancy ring," Grace said. "I just need you." They were married in the Fort Lyon Church on a cold but bright January day in 1877. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her slender frame. Ethan wore a new suit, purchased with 3 month savings and worth every penny, to see the way Grace's eyes lit up when she saw him waiting at the altar. The whole town turned out for the wedding. Samuel Hendricks served as Ethan's best man, and Mrs. Patterson stood up with Grace. The minister spoke about love and commitment, about building a life together through faith and dedication. But what Ethan remembered most was singing their first hymn together as husband and wife. They stood at the altar, hands clasped, and sang "Befeel du Dane Weege" without any accompaniment. Their voices rose together, stronger for their unity, filling the small church with a sound so beautiful that several people later said it was the most moving ceremony they had ever attended. Afterward, there was a reception in the church hall with food provided by the congregation. People danced and laughed, and Ethan felt the weight of years of loneliness lift from his shoulders. He had found his place, his home, his family. That night, in the little house that was now theirs, Grace and Ethan lay together in the darkness, talking about the future. "Samuel offered me a partnership in the ranch," Ethan said. "He is getting older and needs someone to help manage things. It would mean more responsibility but also more money and stability." "That is wonderful," Grace said, her head resting on his chest. "You deserve it, Ethan. You work so hard." "I want to give you a good life, Grace. I want to give you everything you deserve." She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him in the moonlight that filtered through the window. "You already have. You learned my grandmother's songs. You joined your voice with mine. You saw who I was and loved me for it. What more could anyone ask?" He pulled her down for a kiss, marveling at the fact that she was his wife, that this remarkable woman had chosen him. The years that followed were good ones. Ethan became Samuel's partner, and together they built the ranch into one of the most successful in the region. Grace continued her sewing work, though now more for pleasure than necessity. They sang together often, still standing at the clothesline on laundry days, their voices carrying across the yard and into the street beyond. In the spring of 1878, Grace told Ethan she was expecting their first child. He was overjoyed, already imagining teaching the baby to ride, to rope cattle, to sing the old hymns. But Grace had complications with the pregnancy, and their son was born too early, too small. He lived only 3 days before his tiny body gave out. They buried him in the Fort Lyon cemetery on a gray April morning, and for weeks afterward, Grace did not sing. The silence in the house was deafening. Ethan tried everything he could think of to comfort her, but grief was a process that could not be rushed. One morning in late May, Ethan woke to the sound of singing. He found Grace in the backyard, hanging laundry on the line, tears streaming down her face as she sang Befeel du Dane Weege. He went to her immediately, and without a word, he joined his voice to hers. They sang through their tears, the hymn a prayer and a release all at once. When they finished, Grace turned to him and said, "I needed to remember how to hope again." "We will get through this," Ethan said, holding her close. "Together we can get through anything." And they did. Slowly, Grace began to heal, and the music returned to their home. In 1879, she became pregnant again, and this time, everything went as it should. Their son was born healthy and strong in February of 1880, with his mother's green eyes and his father's determined chin. They named him Edward, after Ethan's father. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, and they named her Helen, after Grace's mother. Then another son in 1884, whom they named Samuel after Ethan's partner and friend. The house that had once seemed so small now overflowed with life and laughter. The children grew up hearing both English and German hymns, learning the songs their great-great-grandmother had brought from Bavaria. They sang while doing chores, while getting ready for bed, while riding in the wagon to town. Edward proved to have his mother's musical gift, his voice clear and true even as a young boy. Helen had her father's practical nature, but loved the stories behind the songs. Samuel was still too young to do much more than make joyful noise, but he always clapped enthusiastically when his family sang. Samuel Hendricks, the ranch owner, passed away in 1885, leaving his share of the ranch to Ethan in his will. It was more than Ethan had ever dreamed of owning, and he worked hard to honor the trust his mentor had placed in him. The ranch continued to prosper, and Ethan made sure to treat his workers fairly, remembering what it had been like to be a drifting cowboy with no roots. On their 10th anniversary in 1887, Ethan surprised Grace by taking her to Denver for a week. They stayed in a real hotel, ate in restaurants, and attended a concert featuring German lieder sung by a visiting soprano from New York. Grace cried during the performance, overwhelmed by the beauty and the memories it evoked. "Thank you," she whispered to Ethan afterward, "for never forgetting what matters to me." "How could I forget?" he replied. "Those songs brought me to you." As the children grew older, they began to understand the significance of their parents' story. Edward, at age 10, asked his father why he had learned grandmother's songs. Ethan thought carefully before answering. "Because your mother sang them with such joy and faith that I wanted to understand what gave her that happiness. And because I loved her and wanted to share in something that was important to her." "Did it work?" Ethan smiled. "Better than I ever imagined. Those songs did not just help me understand your mother. They helped me understand myself, what I wanted from life, what kind of man I wanted to be." "Will you teach me to be that kind of man, too?" Ethan pulled his son close, his heart full. "Every day, son, every day." By the early 1890s, The children were growing into young people with their own dreams and ambitions. Edward, now in his early teens, talked about becoming a teacher. Helen wanted to be a nurse. Samuel, still young, changed his mind about his future profession nearly every week, but his enthusiasm never wavered. Grace and Ethan watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and bittersweetness, knowing that someday they would leave to make their own way in the world. But for now, they were still a family under one roof, still singing together on Sunday evenings after supper. The tradition had started when Edward was small. After the Sunday meal, they would gather in the parlor, and the family would sing hymns together. Sometimes they sang the German hymns from Grace's grandmother. Sometimes they sang English hymns they learned at church. It did not matter what language or which songs. What mattered was the togetherness, the harmony of voices raised in unison. One Sunday evening in 1893, after the singing was done and the children had gone to bed, Grace and Ethan sat together on the porch, watching the stars come out over the Colorado plains. "You ever think about that first day?" Grace asked. "When you stood at my fence and listened to me sing?" "All the time," Ethan admitted. "I think about how close I came to just riding past that day, never stopping, never hearing you. My whole life would have been so different. Mine, too." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I was so lonely then, Ethan. I did not even realize how lonely until you showed me what it felt like not to be. You hit it well. You always seemed so content, so at peace. The singing helped. It always has. But singing with someone, sharing those songs with you, that changed everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the chirp of crickets, the soft rustle of wind through the cottonwood trees. "I got a letter from Aunt Greta this week," Grace said eventually. "She is doing well. The companion she hired has become a dear friend, and she wanted to thank me again for suggesting the arrangement. She also sent a little money for the children with strict instructions that it is for something fun, not practical." Ethan chuckled. "She sounds like a character." "She is. I wish the children could meet her, but she is too frail to travel and Pennsylvania is still so far away. Maybe when the children are older we could take them east for a visit. Maybe." Grace smiled up at him. "You would do that, travel all that way?" "Grace, I would travel to the ends of the earth with you. I thought you knew that by now." She kissed him softly. "I do know, but it is still nice to hear." The years continued to pass, marked by small joys and occasional sorrows. Aunt Greta passed away peacefully in 1895, leaving her small estate to Grace. The money was not much, but it was enough to help with the children's educations. Edward went to normal school in Denver to become a teacher, fulfilling his childhood dream. Helen began nursing training. Samuel, growing into a tall, serious young man, decided he wanted to stay on the ranch and learn the business from his father. Grace and Ethan grew older together, their faces gaining lines and their hair showing silver, but their voices remained strong. They still sang together every Monday morning when Grace hung the laundry, a tradition they had maintained for over 20 years. The neighbors had long since stopped commenting on it, simply accepting it as part of the fabric of Fort Lyon life. In 1898, Edward returned from Denver with a young woman named Margaret whom he planned to marry. She was a school teacher like him, practical and kind, and she fit into the family as though she had always been there. The wedding was held in the same church where Grace and Ethan had married 21 years earlier, and once again, the bride and groom sang a hymn during the ceremony. "You started a tradition," Margaret told Grace afterward. "Edward insisted we had to sing." Grace laughed. "Did he teach you German just for the occasion?" "Enough to get through one hymn without embarrassing myself. Though I must admit I prefer English. My pronunciation is terrible." "You sounded beautiful," Grace assured her. "What matters is the love you put into it." Helen married 2 years later to a young doctor she met during her training. They settled in Colorado Springs, where he established a practice, and Helen worked alongside him as his nurse. She came home often to visit, always bringing stories of the city and the work they were doing. Samuel, true to his word, stayed on the ranch. He had a gift for working with horses and cattle, and under Ethan's guidance, he became an excellent rancher. In 1902, at the age of 18, he began courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a spirited young woman named Catherine who could ride as well as any man and was not afraid of hard work. Grace and Ethan found themselves becoming grandparents as their children built families of their own. Edward and Margaret had 3 children in quick succession. Helen and her doctor husband had twins. Samuel and Catherine, married in 1904, gave them their first grandson who was born on the ranch, continuing the family tradition. Through it all, through the joys of weddings and births, through the sorrows of occasional losses and hardships, Grace and Ethan maintained their tradition of singing together. Their voices, aged now but still harmonious, rose every Monday morning from the backyard of the house in Fort Lyon. The children grew up and moved away, then came back for visits with grandchildren in tow. The grandchildren learned the same hymns their parents had learned, the same songs that had been passed down through generations. Some of them had a gift for music like their grandmother. Others could barely carry a tune, but all of them learned the words, and all of them understood that these songs were part of their heritage, their history. By 1910, Fort Lyon had changed considerably from the small town Ethan had first ridden into 34 years earlier. The railroad had come through, bringing more people and more commerce. The town had grown, sprouted new buildings, new businesses, but some things remained the same. The church still stood on the same corner. Mrs. Patterson, now quite elderly, still lived next door to Grace and Ethan, though her daughter had moved in to care for her. And every Monday morning, weather permitting, the sound of hymns still floated through the air. Ethan was 61 now, his body showing the wear of decades of ranch work. His hands were gnarled, his back sometimes ached, but he still insisted on helping with the laundry every Monday. It had become their time, sacred and inviolate, when they reconnected with each other and with the moment that had brought them together. One particular Monday in June, as they hung sheets together and sang "Nun danket a legat," Samuel came riding up the lane at a gallop. He pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted quickly, his face flushed with excitement. "Pa, Ma, you are not going to believe this. Catherine just told me we are expecting again. Twins this time, the doctor thinks." Grace clapped her hands together in delight. "Oh, Samuel, that is wonderful news. How is Catherine feeling?" "Tired but happy. She sent me to tell you right away." As Samuel shared more details about Catherine's condition and the doctor's advice, Ethan looked at his wife and saw her eyes shining with joy. This was the legacy they had built together, not just children and grandchildren, but love that multiplied and spread like ripples in a pond. That evening, after Samuel had returned to his own home on the ranch, Grace and Ethan sat on their porch as they had done countless times over the years. "Can you believe it?" Grace said. "Twins. We are going to have 2 more grandchildren running around." "Our family keeps growing," Ethan agreed. "Sometimes I look around and cannot quite believe all of this came from one cowboy stopping to listen to a woman sing." "It was not just stopping to listen," Grace said. "It was caring enough to learn the songs. It was wanting to be part of something that mattered to me." "That is what made the difference, Ethan. You did not just admire from a distance. You joined in." "Best decision I ever made." Grace reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining as naturally as their voices in harmony. Do you remember what that first hymn meant? The one you learned? Commit thou all thy ways, Ethan said. Trust in God's provision and guidance. That is what we have done, is it not? We committed our ways to each other and to something larger than ourselves, and look what came of it. They sat in the gathering twilight, holding hands and listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Somewhere in the distance, one of Samuel's ranch hands was singing as he worked, the tune carrying faintly on the breeze. "He is singing one of our hymns," Grace said with a smile. "Can you hear it?" Ethan listened and realized she was right. The melody was Ein Fest Borg, which Grace had taught him in those early months of their courtship. "I taught that one to the men last month during a long cattle drive. It helped pass the time. The songs keep spreading," Grace said softly, "just like grandmother hoped they would. She used to say that music was a gift that multiplied in the giving. The more you shared, the more there was to share." She was right about that. She was right about a lot of things. "I wish she could have met you," Grace said. "She would have loved you." "I wish I could have met her too. I would have thanked her for teaching you those songs. Without them, I never would have had an excuse to talk to you," Grace laughed. "Oh, I think you would have found an excuse eventually. You were quite persistent with your riding past the house every few days. You noticed that?" "Of course I noticed. I may have even timed my laundry days to coincide with when I thought you might pass by." Ethan turned to stare at her. "Grace Zimmerman Barnes, are you telling me you were scheming to catch my attention?" She tried to look innocent but could not quite pull it off. "Perhaps a little. A woman has to do what she can." He pulled her close and kissed her soundly. "You are full of surprises, even after all these years." "I hope I always will be." The summer of 1910 was particularly hot and dry. The ranch struggled with the weather, and Ethan spent long days in the saddle checking on water sources and moving cattle to better grazing. He came home exhausted each evening, and Grace worried about him pushing himself too hard. "You are not 25 anymore," she reminded him one evening as he practically fell into a chair at the supper table. "I know that well enough," he replied. "But the cattle still need tending, and Samuel cannot do it all himself. Samuel has 3 ranch hands helping him. Let them do more of the work." "I am fine, Grace, just tired." But over the following weeks, his exhaustion did not improve. He developed a cough that would not go away, and by August, Grace insisted he see the doctor. The news was not good. The doctor diagnosed him with pneumonia, likely contracted during a long, wet cattle drive in early summer that had never quite gone away. He needed rest, real rest and medicine. For the first time in his working life, Ethan was forced to spend his days in bed instead of on horseback. It chafed at him terribly, but Grace was firm. "The ranch will survive without you for a few weeks," she said. "But I cannot survive without you, so you will stay in this bed and get better." The children came to visit, taking turns staying with their parents to help Grace care for Ethan. Samuel ran the ranch without complaint. Helen brought medicine and her nursing expertise. Edward came with his wife and children, and the sound of the grandchildren playing in the house seemed to lift Ethan's spirits more than any medicine could. Through it all, Grace sang. She sang while preparing his meals, while changing his sheets, while sitting beside his bed in the evening. Sometimes Ethan was strong enough to join in, his voice raspy but determined. Other times he just listened, letting her voice wash over him like a healing balm. It took most of August and well into September, but eventually, Ethan recovered. The cough faded, his strength returned, and by October he was back on horseback, though not for as many hours as before. The illness had been a reminder that he was mortal, that his body had limits. "I am slowing down," he admitted to Grace one evening. "I hate it, but I cannot deny it." "We both are," she replied. That is life, Ethan. We have had good years, strong years. Now we are entering a different phase. I do not like it, I know. But think of it this way. The less time you spend working, the more time we have for other things, for sitting on the porch, for visiting with the grandchildren, for singing. He had to admit she had a point. Over the following year, Ethan gradually transitioned more of the ranch responsibilities to Samuel. He still worked, still helped with the important decisions and the training of young horses, but he was no longer driving himself from dawn to dusk. The change was difficult at first, but Grace was right. They had more time together and they used it well. They took walks around Fort Lyon, visiting with neighbors and friends. They attended church socials and community events. They babysat grandchildren and told them stories of the old days. And every Monday morning, they hung laundry together and sang. In 1914, the world beyond their small corner of Colorado erupted into war. The conflict seemed distant at first, something happening in far-off Europe that had nothing to do with them. But as the war dragged on and eventually drew in the United States in 1917, it touched even Fort Lyon. Several young men from the town enlisted, including one of Edward's sons, now 18 and eager to serve. The family gathered for a tearful goodbye at the train station, and Grace sang a hymn of blessing and protection as the train pulled away. The war years were difficult. Food and goods were rationed. Anxiety hung over the community like a shadow as people waited for news from overseas. But the family rallied together, supporting each other through the uncertainty. Grace threw herself into war work, organizing the women of Fort Lyon to roll bandages, knit socks, and collect supplies for the soldiers. Ethan, too old for military service himself, used his position as a respected rancher to help coordinate food production and distribution for the war effort. Through it all, the singing continued. If anything, it became more important than ever, a reminder of faith and continuity in a world that seemed to have gone mad. The hymns were prayers made audible, hopes given voice. The war finally ended in November of 1918, and by the grace of God, Edward's son returned home safely. The family celebration was tearful and joyous, and they sang hymns of thanksgiving until their voices were hoarse. The 1920s brought new changes. Fort Lyon continued to grow and modernize. Automobiles became common, replacing horses on many streets. Electricity came to more homes, including Grace and Ethan's, though they agreed it was strange not to need lamps anymore. The telephone arrived, and Grace marveled at being able to talk to Helen in Colorado Springs without traveling there. But some things did not change. The Monday morning laundry tradition continued, though now Grace had an electric washing machine that made the work easier. They still hung the clothes outside on nice days, and they still sang while doing it. By the mid-1920s, Ethan and Grace were both in their 70s. Their bodies had slowed considerably, but their minds remained sharp, and their love for each other had only deepened with time. They were a familiar sight in Fort Lyon, the elderly couple who could often be seen walking hand in hand down Main Street, occasionally breaking into song if the mood struck them. The grandchildren were grown now, starting families of their own, making Grace and Ethan great-grandparents. The younger generation still learned the hymns, though now they competed with jazz music and popular songs on the radio. But in the Barnes family, the old German hymns remained important, a connection to their heritage and to the love story that had started their family. One Monday morning in June of 1926, Grace and Ethan were hanging laundry as usual. It was a beautiful day, warm but not too hot, with a breeze that made the sheets billow like sails. They were singing Befiel du dein Wege, their voices a bit creaky with age but still in harmony, when Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter came running into the yard. "Mr. Barnes, Miss Grace, come quick. Grandmother has had a spell. We need help." They immediately stopped what they were doing and hurried next door as quickly as their old legs could carry them. Mrs. Patterson, now 93 years old, had collapsed in her sitting room. The doctor was sent for, but by the time he arrived, the old woman had passed peacefully away. Grace held her hand and sang him softly during her last moments. Mrs. Patterson opened her eyes briefly, smiled at Grace and whispered, "Still singing after all these years? How wonderful," before slipping away. The funeral was well attended and Grace sang at the service, her voice wavering with grief but still beautiful. Afterward, she and Ethan walked slowly home, both feeling the weight of their own mortality more than they had in years. "We are the old ones now," Grace said softly. "All our contemporaries are gone or going. It is strange to realize we are at the end of our story." "I would not say the end," Ethan replied. "Maybe the final chapter, but it is not finished yet." "No," she agreed. "Not yet." They continued their routines as much as they were able. Ethan still went out to the ranch most days, though now Samuel drove him in an automobile rather than him riding horseback. Grace still did her sewing, though her eyes were not what they once were, and she needed bright light to see her stitches. And they still sang together every Monday morning. On a Monday in October of 1927, they were hanging laundry together as they had done for 50 years. The autumn air was crisp and clear, and the cottonwood trees were brilliant gold against the blue sky. They sang "Nun danket alle Gott," their voices twining together in the familiar harmony. As they reached the final verse, Ethan felt a sharp pain in his chest. He tried to keep singing, not wanting to worry Grace, but the pain intensified and he gasped. Grace turned to him immediately. "Ethan, what is wrong?" "My chest," he managed to say before the pain became overwhelming and he fell to his knees. Grace screamed for help, and neighbors came running. They carried Ethan inside and sent for the doctor, but even as Grace held his hand and begged him to stay with her, they both knew this was something medicine could not fix. The doctor confirmed it was his heart. There was nothing to be done except keep him comfortable and wait. The family gathered quickly. Samuel and Catherine came from the ranch. Helen and her husband drove from Colorado Springs. Edward arrived from Denver with his family. They filled the small house, but Ethan insisted on seeing each of them, sharing final words and blessings. As evening fell and Ethan's breathing became more labored, he asked everyone to leave except Grace. When they were alone, he reached for her hand. "Grace," he whispered, "my Grace, I am not afraid." "I know," she said through her tears. "You have never been afraid of anything." "Not true." "I was terrified when I first asked if I could learn your songs. Terrified you would say no, that I would never have a chance with you." She smiled through her tears. "I could never have said no to you. I love you. I have loved you every day since I first heard you sing. Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. And you have been mine," Grace said, her voice breaking. "Everything good in my life came from loving you." "Sing for me," he asked. "One more time," Grace nodded, unable to speak. She took a breath and began to sing Befehl du dein Wege, the hymn that had started everything, the hymn that meant commit thou all thy ways. As her voice filled the room, Ethan closed his eyes. A smile touched his lips, and Grace saw him mouth the words, following along even though he could no longer give voice to them. She sang through her tears, the words blurring but the melody remaining true. When she reached the final verse, about trusting in God's faithfulness and provision, she felt Ethan's hand relax in hers. His breathing stopped, and his face settled into a peaceful expression. Grace finished the hymn even though he was gone because she knew he would want her to complete it. When the last note faded into silence, she laid her head on his chest and wept. The funeral was the largest Fort Lyon had seen in years. The church overflowed with people who had known Ethan and Grace, whose lives had been touched by their love story and their music. Grace, flanked by her children, sang at the service, her voice unwavering despite her grief. She sang Nun Dankit a Legat because it had been Ethan's favorite, the hymn they had sung together at church all those years ago. As her voice rose in the familiar melody, she could almost hear his voice joining hers, the rough warmth of his tone blending with her clarity. The congregation joined in, and the church was filled with song, a celebration of a life well lived and a love that had endured. In the days and weeks that followed, Grace moved through her grief with the same quiet strength she had shown throughout her life. Her children wanted her to move in with one of them, but she refused. "This is my home," she told them. "This is where my life with your father happened. I am not ready to leave it." So she stayed in the house, and she kept her routines. Every Monday morning, she hung laundry on the line and sang the old hymns. Her voice was lonely now, missing its harmony, but she sang anyway because it was what Ethan would have wanted. The neighbors grew accustomed to seeing her in the backyard, this elderly woman with white hair pinned up in a bun, hanging sheets and towels while singing in German. Children would sometimes stop on the street to listen, and Grace would smile and wave at them. One Monday morning in the spring of 1928, a young couple stopped at her fence. The woman was pregnant, just beginning to show, and they both looked travel-worn and uncertain. "Excuse me, madam," the man said. "We are new in town looking for work. Do you know anyone who might be hiring?" Grace studied them for a moment, seeing in their faces the echo of her own past, of Ethan's when he first came to Fort Lyon. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Ranch work, mostly. I am a good hand with cattle and horses. My wife takes in washing and sewing when she can." Grace made a decision. "My son runs a ranch just outside of town. I will send word that he should talk to you. Come back tomorrow morning and I will have an answer for you." The couple's faces lit up with hope. "Thank you, madam. Thank you so much." As they turned to leave, Grace called out, "Wait. What are your names?" "I am Tom Harrison, and this is my wife, Mary." "Welcome to Fort Lyon, Tom and Mary. I hope you will be very happy here." After they left, Grace went inside and wrote a letter to Samuel, recommending the young couple. She told him about the look in their eyes, the determination mixed with uncertainty, the way they held hands as though afraid to let go of each other. She asked him, as a favor to her, to give them a chance. Samuel, who could never refuse his mother anything, hired Tom the next day. The Harrisons settled into Fort Lyon and, over time, became part of the community. Mary gave birth to a healthy boy that summer, and Grace made a point of teaching the young mother some of her hymns. "My husband taught me these songs," Grace explained as they sat in her parlor one afternoon. "Well, I taught him, but he learned them out of love for me. They have been a blessing to our family for 50 years. I hope they will bless yours too." Mary listened carefully, learning the unfamiliar German words, and promised to sing them to her son. Grace lived for 3 more years after Ethan's death. They were quiet years, marked by visits from family, by her continued sewing work, and by her Monday morning singing. She saw more grandchildren and great-grandchildren born. She watched Fort Lyon continue to grow and change. She maintained her independence and her dignity, even as her body grew frailer. On a Monday morning in November of 1930, Grace hung her laundry as usual. It was a cold day, with winter threatening in the steel-gray clouds overhead. She sang Befiel du Dane Weege as she worked, her voice thin but still true. When she finished hanging the last towel, she stood for a moment, looking at the sheets billowing in the cold wind. Then she went inside, sat down in her favorite chair by the window, and closed her eyes. Samuel found her that evening when he came to check on her. She looked peaceful, her hands folded in her lap, a small smile on her face. On the table beside her was a letter she had written to her children, expressing her love and her gratitude for the life she had lived. The letter ended with these words: "Do not grieve too much for me. I have had a beautiful life filled with love and music and family. Your father taught me that the greatest gift we can give each other is to truly see and value who the other person is. He saw me, he valued me, and he loved me not in spite of my quirks but because of them. I pray you all find such love in your own lives. Sing the old songs. Remember where you came from, and know that love, true love, is worth any effort, any sacrifice, any challenge. All my love, Mother." Grace was buried beside Ethan in the Fort Lyon cemetery. Once again, the church overflowed with mourners. Her children and grandchildren sang at her service, performing Befehl du den Weege in 4-part harmony that would have made her proud. There was not a dry eye in the church as their voices rose in the familiar melody. After the service, as people filed past the casket to pay their respects, many remarked that Grace looked peaceful, as though she had simply gone to sleep. And perhaps, in a way, she had, finally reunited with the cowboy who had loved her enough to learn her songs. The house on the side street in Fort Lyon passed to Samuel, who kept it maintained but could not bring himself to sell it or change it significantly. It remained as Grace and Ethan had left it, a testament to their life together. The clothesline stayed in the backyard, and sometimes, on quiet Monday mornings, the neighbors swore they could still hear singing drifting on the breeze. The hymns Grace had taught to her family continued to be passed down through the generations. Her great-great-grandchildren, born decades after her death, learned Befehl du den Weege and Nun danket a legat, and the other songs she had treasured. They might not have understood all the German words, but they understood the spirit behind them, the faith and hope and enduring love. Tom and Mary Harrison's descendants remained in Fort Lyon, and they too carried the songs with them. Mary taught them to her son, who taught them to his children, who taught them to their children. The hymns became woven into the fabric of the community, a living memorial to Grace and Ethan's love. Years later, when Samuel was an old man himself, he was interviewed by a historian doing research on Fort Lyon's early days. The historian asked him what he remembered most about his parents. Samuel thought for a long moment before answering. "Monday mornings," he said finally. "Every Monday morning of my childhood, I would wake up to the sound of my parents singing in the backyard. My father had this rough, warm voice, and my mother's was clear and sweet, and when they sang together, it was like hearing something holy. They sang in German, old hymns my great-grandmother brought from Bavaria, and they sang with such joy, such pure happiness in each other, that you could not help but smile hearing them. That is what I remember most. Not the big moments, not the dramatic stories, but those simple Monday mornings when they hung laundry together and sang. That was love. That was what real, lasting love looked like." The historian included Samuel's words in his book about Fort Lyon, and the story of the cowboy who learned hymns to court the woman he loved became part of the town's history. It was told and retold, embellished and simplified, but the heart of it remained true. A young cowboy had heard a woman singing while hanging laundry. He had fallen in love with her voice and then with her. He had learned her grandmother's hymns in a language he did not speak, not because it was easy or natural, but because he wanted to share in something that mattered to her. And that simple act of love and dedication had built a legacy that lasted for generations. In the end, That is what love is. It is not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, though those have their place. It is the daily choice to show up, to listen, to learn what matters to the other person and value it as your own. It is standing at a clothesline on a Monday morning and raising your voice in harmony with the person you love, singing songs you never thought you would learn, in a language you never thought you would speak, because being together is worth any effort. Grace and Ethan had understood that. They had lived it, and their love, expressed through music and devotion and the simple act of hanging laundry together, had created ripples that spread far beyond what either of them could have imagined on that first day when a dusty cowboy stopped to listen to a woman sing. The house still stands in Fort Lyon, Colorado, though it has been renovated and updated over the years. The clothesline is gone, replaced by an electric dryer like most modern homes have. But if you visit on certain quiet mornings, if you stand in that backyard and listen very carefully, some say you can still hear the echo of two voices raised in harmony, singing hymns of faith and hope and enduring love. Whether that is true or just a romantic notion, who can say? But the story itself, the love itself, was real. And that, perhaps, is miracle enough.